This morning we are doing Matthew 15. You know how I can have my goals and we're gonna, but anyhow, if we don't finish Matthew 15, that's okay. Most of the stories in Matthew 15 are pretty familiar because they were in Mark and Luke too, most of them. So anyhow, so of course, I know you'll recognize them. So anyhow, so starting off with Matthew 15 verses 1 through 9, Barclay titles it Clean and Unclean. So it does lead into a big discussion. Yep, Sarah's ready for us. So we are going to have a big discussion about that clean versus unclean. Barclay gets into more details about that are kind of interesting.
Yeah, I actually learned stuff I didn't know. I love Barclay.
Yeah. So he does give us some more detail about that kind of stuff. So to understand more about what some folks were living with and still do. And we'll talk some about that too. All right, so Sarah, if you'll read it for us, please.
Okay. Then the Pharisees and scribes from Jerusalem approached Jesus. Why, they said, do your disciples transgress the tradition of our elders? They do so transgress because they do not wash their hands before they eat bread. Jesus answered them, why do you too transgress God's commandment? Because of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses his father and mother, let him die. But as for you, you say, whoever says to his father or mother, that by which you might have been helped by me is a dedicated gift, will certainly not honor his father and his mother, and is yet guiltless. You have annulled the commandment of God through your tradition. Hypocrites, Isaiah in his prophecy described you well. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. It is in vain that they reverence me, for it is man-made commandments that they teach as their teaching.
Okay, so in this interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees, Barclay describes this as a collision between the two religions. So, so it's not so much a clash as some of the other interactions have been, but he describes this as really being a collision of the two views of religion and the two views of God, two views of the divinity of God. We're having double vision of you, Joe. All right.
I had my other computer, you went away. My old computer, you went away. I mean, I could still hear you, but I couldn't see you. So I got my new one, and I was surprised to see two of me as well.
Oh,
Okay. I
okay.
hadn't had coffee yet. That was a bit much to take this early.
He finally admitted he's living a double life.
Oh.
Ooh, I hadn't thought about that with technology, new definition, new perspective on double lives.
Why do I not see Bud?
Oh, they're on vacation.
Oh, okay.
They are, I think they're getting back today. So they are probably driving back. They went out to see Bud's mother. So last Sunday they were with us, joining us from the nursing home where she was. Okay. Because the nursing home has or assisted living center has an apartment that family members can rent.
Oh, nice.
So that's where they were last Sunday. So then they went to Kentucky to see Susan's brother. So, okay, so the whole clean versus unclean, and we know from previous discussions that that was a pretty detailed process as far as what made you clean and unclean. So uncleanness came about from contact with certain persons or things. So if a woman had a hemorrhage, of course, even normal cycle, she was unclean, and she was unclean for a period of time after having a child. Every dead body was unclean, and to touch it meant you became unclean, as well as every Gentile. So That was part of the rules. If, as a Jew, if you touched a Gentile, then you were unclean. And this uncleanness was transferable in that if a mice were unclean. So if a mouse touched a vessel, then the vessel was unclean and everything in that vessel was unclean. So, I think about folks that get real anxious about germs and stuff, with my own thoughts at times, especially this past year and a half. Oh my gosh, like this morning I went out and discovered a tomato that had been half eaten. And so I picked the tomato and then I'm like, oh my gosh, what if it was a rabid animal? Am I going to get rabies? So anyhow, so that whole thing. So to me, it just would have been a never ending process. And I know that with Passover, there's a process to go through to remove all the leaven in your house. Claire, was that something your family did when you were a kid, as far as those traditions? Any of those
My
traditions?
family observed anything having to do with, but what was interesting was that when we were at the age where everyone got bar mitzvahed, my father took us to Israel for a month instead. So there was no organized religion of any sort permitted, but he still wanted to have us understand the cultural, I guess, aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, this unclean extends to the point where I knew someone who was, thinking that he kept kosher. So he said, no, I can't come over to your house because, for lunch, because you're not kosher. And I was like, well, you can stop off, get a kosher meal to go and bring it and eat that. And he said, no, your refrigerator is unclean.
That transfer, yeah.
Right. So it gets to the point where you're just like, yeah.
You're a prisoner.
So
What did you say, Stuart?
I said, you're a prisoner.
it really is. And when I was very little and I had a friend whose grandparents kept strict, they were Orthodox. I would have to go, when I would stay over her house, sometimes we would have to go to the grandmother's apartment if the parents were out. And the grandmother, I could even tell, even though I was small, the fact that I was in that apartment was like it was like having a contagion in there that was absolutely unacceptable, and it was just ridiculous.
Well, and now that have been through this year and a half of COVID stuff, precautions, I feel like I have a little bit better understanding, at the point that we really didn't understand what was going on. And, we're wiping down our groceries, or I would leave mine sitting out in the sun for 20 minutes, that kind of stuff. But there was that logic, but
you see, the difference is, I understand when I read, like in Deuteronomy, about shellfish being unclean, because back in the day, if you think about it, it made sense to not eat things that were garbage feeders. Right. So a lot of these things like swine and shellfish, that I could understand where that could be considered unclean for bacterial reasons. Mm-hmm. But to tell me that the refrigerator is not kosher, and that's why when I got to the point where I was reading, for the first time, that Jesus said, what you eat does not make you unclean. What comes out of your mouth and out of your heart is what makes you unclean, or clean or unclean. That was the most exciting revelation to me I think I've ever, it was just right up there with the top 3, because I just wanted to jump up and down and yell, see, I'm not treif. Treif means unclean.
Mm-hmm.
So it was,
and we're going to get to that passage. That's part of chapter 15.
Yeah, I mean, this just makes me so happy, because Jesus is like, it's not these rules and regulations that can evaluate a person. It's what God sees on the inside. And that was just awesome.
Right.
And one thing I learned, and Kathy, it might have been part of that great courses thing that we looked at back a year ago, that unclean does not necessarily mean dirty or, with bacteria. It meant you were not able to approach God. And initially, those rules really only applied to the temple. You had to worry about ritual cleanliness if you were going to enter the temple.
And Barclay makes that point at somewhere in here.
Somewhere along the line, yeah. And that course that I was talking about, the woman said, so the people that, lived out in the countryside, they didn't worry about all this stuff because they weren't going to the temple. So I'm not sure how pervasive it got throughout the countryside. Although this passage makes it sound like it was out there because Jesus was wandering Galilee. He wasn't in Jerusalem when this was happening.
Yeah, but the Pharisees also, I don't think they didn't represent all of Judaism either.
True.
They were one part of, just like, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is one part of Protestant, or small part of Christian, one group. The Pharisees, I think, were just one perspective. So, all right. So, and Judaism was not the only religion that had these unclean beliefs. Barclay talks about an Indian guy that he knew or read his book or whatever, and he converted from Hinduism to Christianity, and so his family considered him unclean. And so he really wasn't supposed to come to the house. If he came to the house, then where anything he touched or he went was unclean. And he and his mother were close, and she would let him sneak in the house, but the servants didn't want to clean his dishes. And sometimes his aunt would come along after him and to clean where he sat, which this doesn't make any sense to me. She would sprinkle water from the Ganges or water mixed with cow dung to clean to make places clean where he had been. So
But, I know, didn't know her well, had a conversation with a Christian woman whose son had married a Jewish girl and converted to Judaism. And his mother, although, this is kind of a different type of thing, his mother kind of had the same reaction. He'd gone to the dark side. He'd given up his salvation. And she was practically in tears. And, in fact, it was at the In Stitches down in Chester, Stuart. And we used to sit around the table on Wednesday nights, and we could sit and stitch and bitch, and we would just talk. And I don't know why she confided in me, and I very quietly sat there and we talked theology for a few minutes. And I told her that I said, I understand why you think that. I know the verse, but I personally don't believe that. And she seemed to feel better that at least somebody didn't think he was going to hell.
Right.
Because she really seemed to think he was going to hell because he'd thrown away his salvation.
Right. Because in many, many churches, when we were growing up, if it wasn't taught directly, there was an implication, and the church that I grew up in, there was not that direct teaching. And the minister had, and it was very well known, there was stuff we did there were some activities between us and the synagogue in the neighborhood and that kind of stuff. But there were still, there was an implied message among a lot of people, oh, those Jews, or oh, those Catholics.
Well, yeah, last night at church, there was a couple visiting, and the wife was just gushing about how much she loved Bon Air Christian Church, that her husband was Catholic and she was Protestant, and she would go to church with her husband, but because she was not Catholic, she was not allowed to take communion.
No, you're not.
And she said, I love the inclusiveness that I see here. I miss communion when I go with him. So kind of the same thing. You're not good enough to take communion with us.
No, I mean, growing up when all of my friends were Catholic, I thought if you were Christian, you were Catholic. I didn't know there was anything else. I would go to church with them, and when they went up to take communion, they made it very clear to me that if I set foot out of that pew, that it would be horrible. So, don't move, we'll be back, don't move. Like, okay. So that's why the first time I went to take communion at BACC, I almost fainted. Because I was so scared that the roof of the sanctuary was going to come off or something. I didn't understand the inclusive. I didn't understand it.
One of the most moving experiences I had when I was in college, there were a group of us that went to a retreat up in Kentucky, and the guys went and stayed at the monastery at oh crap, it just went out of my head. The monastery where Thomas Merton lived. They could stay there. We weren't allowed, the women weren't allowed on the grounds. And so we stayed at a convent that was several miles down the road. Anyhow, and so while we were there, we met with some of the nuns. And one night, one of the nuns says, well, let's go have communion. And we're all like, ooh, we don't want to upset things. And she said, no, we're going to go down to the pond. So she grabbed a bottle of, Catholic communion wine. And we went down and sat on the picnic table down by the pond and had communion together. She grabbed some communion wafers. So there are Catholics out there, and there are some Catholic churches now that you can get in line with everybody else to get communion, but you have to tell the priest that you're not Catholic, and he will give you a blessing instead of giving you the cup and the wine. I mean, the bread and the wine. So
I actually took communion in a Catholic church one time because I didn't realize all of this, this is forbidden. And I went up and took it just like everybody else, and the roof stayed on the church.
Well, when I was a kid growing up in Protestant church, yeah, it does. In Protestant churches, if you had visitors and it was Sunday morning, you took your visitors to church. Well, my step grandmother was Catholic, and so a couple of my uncles, my half uncles and stuff, they're Catholic. So on Sunday morning, they would go to church, and we were never invited to go.
Mm.
We were never invited to go. So anyhow, and Gary and I talk about that. We've talked about that a number of times. He's no longer Catholic. But anyhow.
I can't help thinking that whole thing of people not being allowed to take communion would really piss God off.
Well, and there's been, it's been interesting because there's been a movement in the Catholic Church among a good portion of folks, because for a while I got on their mailing list, that if politicians who are Catholic and do not oppose abortion should not be allowed to receive communion. Whatever their personal beliefs are, but if their political perspective is that it's a personal choice or whatever, if they're not strongly opposed to abortion, they should not be allowed to receive communion.
Well, has it been decided if Biden can have communion?
Well, apparently it is such that the Archbishop can, for that, his area can decide that, and the Archbishop for DC has said, I'm not doing that. But there's a movement afoot among the College of Bishops or whatever they're called in the United States to make that decision. So, because that also affects Tim Kaine too. So,
I can understand.
There's been a number of memes that I've seen in recent weeks about, hey, how would this really sit with God?
Yeah. Well, I think the way the rules are now is you have to be in good standing to take communion. And if you support or allow abortion, you're not in good standing. So that violates that internal rule. And I can understand people who feel that way because those are the rules. Now, to take a step back, should you have this philosophy where you can't take communion unless you're in good standing, that's the part that I object to. I think it ought to be something that everybody is allowed to do, regardless of whether you're a Catholic in good standing, a Catholic in bad standing, or a non-Catholic. it should be open to everybody.
Right, it's between you and God.
Correct.
Right. And Jesus said, I don't remember where he said, some of y'all might be able to say where it is. You know, if you've sinned against your brother, you need to go to your brother before you, or is it Paul that said that?
No, I think. I
No,
don't
it's
remember.
Jesus. I think it's Jesus. I think they both carry the same thread, but I think
Yeah, I think it is Jesus.
Well, I think if we're going to try to think like God, he's probably a whole lot more pissed off about using abortion as birth control than he is about people not being allowed to take communion.
Well, we're not God, so we don't know. We got some good ideas, but all right. So I want to get through this part. So talk a little bit more about the dietary stuff to help understand some of because Orthodox Jews still follow a lot of these dietary and clean and unclean rules. And there's a couple of different shows on Netflix now about ultra Orthodox Jews and what their lives are like. One of them is called The Unorthodox Life, and it's about a woman that left, who was married to an ultra Orthodox and left, and most of her kids are grown, and so most of them have left too, and she's almost gone to the other extreme. So it's interesting to see. But as far as some of the clean versus unclean, we've talked about the kosher stuff. It's not just pigs that you can't eat, but also rabbit or hare, because it's animals whose their hoof is not parted and chew the cud. Do rabbits chew the cud? I don't know, but rabbits can't eat rabbits. You can't eat any animal that died naturally. I didn't realize that because you can't eat the blood. The blood all has to be drained out. And Barclay later goes on to make the point that for the Jews, that piece about, you can't eat the blood because the blood is the life force in animals, which makes sense. To me, that's where it makes sense. The belief about refusing to touch dead bodies, that has to do with, may well have had something to do, Barclay says, with belief in evil spirits. And then animals that were worshipped and sacred to other religions, like the crocodile and cats for Egyptians, that they would tend to believe those as being unclean. There is some, hygiene. We've talked before about this. Some hygiene and safety issues for some of these. Let's see. But some of them, there just really wasn't much, didn't make much sense about them. And then the whole cleansing issue, there were very specific rules about how you're supposed to wash before eating, that you had to use the amount of water, you had to use at least a quarter of a log. I'm like, well, how do you define a quarter of a log? And it was defined as the amount of water that would be in an eggshell and a half. Of course, our eggs are pretty big now. So, I imagine then, those chicken eggs were probably more like this, I would guess. So, anyhow.
That's interesting too, because they weren't allowed to eat chickens.
I did not come across that. He did talk about how the bird, as far as what birds you could eat, that's in Leviticus chapter 11.
No, I guarantee chicken is permissible because that was the steady diet.
Right. So in Leviticus, the birds that were to be regarded as detestable, the tawny vulture, the griffin, the osprey, the kite, various kinds of buzzards, all kinds of ravens, the ostrich, the screech owl, the seagull, various kinds of horned owls, night owls, cormorant, barn owls, ibis, pelican, white vulture, stork, the various kinds of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. So that's what Leviticus has listed. So it sounds like most of those are birds that are known for eating other animals.
Scavengers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought Jerusalem have rules and laws against having any chickens within the walls of Jerusalem, so I therefore thought they probably were deemed unclean.
I mean, where you keep keep chickens, like over time it gets to be pretty unclean, you know, from a health perspective. But
Yeah.
anyhow, all right. So getting into this washing, so there were very specific directions about how your hands, you're supposed to wash, cleanse yourself before you eat. You know, the water has to run down your hands, down your arm, but it's not supposed to run past your wrist. It's supposed to drip off at your wrist. And your fingers have to, it sounds like it has to be sort of like up like this. And then there's another time you have to do it so it runs down like this. So, and water jars were kept ready at all times about this. So, all right, so getting more specifically to, you know, what Jesus confronts the Pharisees about as far as how the laws got, Jesus sort of saying how the laws got manipulated about honoring your father and your mother. All right, so if we go back, because we've covered a lot of territory, if we go back and look at the original passage, you know, so the Pharisees' point is they don't wash their hands before they eat bread. And then, but Jesus comes back at them talking about how, you know, what God said was honor your mother and your father, and he who curses his mother and father, let him die. But the Pharisees were teaching that you could give a gift to your parent, but you could qualify it basically, you know, in terms of, and so give yourself an out. So he's saying, hey, you know, you can't have it both ways. To me is what Jesus is saying, the more important point of what he's saying.
I don't follow the whole conversation. You know, to me, it's like they're talking about two separate things. You know, like you haven't gone to the border. Well, I haven't been to Europe. What? You know, they don't wash their hands.
I think you just summed it up.
Well, I think, you know, the Pharisees were nitpicking about washing your hands. All right. Because when we get to this next passage that Claire referred to, altogether, it's going to make more sense. But Jesus comes back at them, well, hey, you know, there really is a bigger issue here on your side. You know, the washing your hands pretty much comes from, who does that really come from? This whole piece about washing your hands and how you wash your hands and how much water you have to use, when you have to do it. What about what God specifically said about honoring your mother and your father?
So he was comparing the Leviticus laws that were created by man to one of the 10 commandments and saying, you know, I'll see your Leviticus and raise you a 10 commandment that you violated. Okay.
Right. And the hypocrisy, you know, because then the passage ends, this passage ends with him referring to Isaiah. And he, you know, Jesus says to him specifically, you have annulled the commandment of God through your tradition. After talking about honoring your father and your mother, you know, that the way you've interpreted, you're annulling God's, the commandment. And then Isaiah and his statements about hypocrites, then he quotes Isaiah in his statement about hypocrites. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. It is in vain that they reverence me, for it is man-made commandments that they teach as their teaching. That's him quoting from Isaiah. So that's what Jesus is confronting them about. You have all these rules, and where did those rules come from? All right, so we talked about the washing. Okay. So let's go to 15, 10 through 20. Sarah, you want to read this again? Do you mind?
I don't mind. Hold on, let me get there. Boy, he did a long bit on that first one. Okay. Jesus called the crowd and said to them, listen and understand. It is not that which goes into the mouth which defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, that defiles a man. Then his disciples came to him and said, do you know that when the Pharisees heard your saying, they were shocked by it? He answered, every plant which my heavenly Father did not plant will be rooted up. Let them be. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both of them will fall into the ditch. Peter said to him, tell us what this dark saying means. He said, are you even yet without understanding? Do you not know that everything which goes into a man's mouth goes down into the stomach and is evacuated out into the drain? But that which comes out of the mouth comes from the heart, and it is these things which defile a man. For from the heart come pernicious thoughts, acts of murder, adultery, theft, false witness, slander. It is these things which defile a man. To eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man.
All right, so the first passage and this passage, taking it all together, you know, the message of these two all together. So Jesus first is talking, the Pharisees come up to Jesus and he's first talking to them. Now he calls to the crowd. He turns to the crowd that probably has gathered around and says to them, because they're, you know, a number of them may be very well listening, probably are, and says directly to them, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man. It's what comes out. So he's really confronting all this, you know, and setting that message of a religion of laws and rules versus a religion of love of God and love for others because of that love for God, that refocus, and how, you know, how parts of Judaism really had gotten off track. And that lesson for us now, you know, it's a constant lesson that all of humanity has to keep learning, I think. You know, we've talked so many times about the rules in Catholicism. We're talking about who can take and who can't take communion. And I was like Claire, oh no, you sat in the pew and you didn't, you know. And so what that's like, but to that doesn't mean that people in the Catholic Church aren't loving and giving and work to honor God, but that's the rule of their faith.
Well, Barclay makes this point somewhere in this chapter, and Bernie McDonald has said it more times than I can count, that being Catholic was very easy because you had the rules. You follow the rules and you're okay.
Right.
And there are some people, and some of them are in our church, who that's all they want. They want the rules. They want the certainty. If I do this, I'm good. If I do that, I'm bad. I know not to do this. I know to do this. I've got it covered.
Right. That there is a need for that.
Yeah. And some people want that structure and other people feel strangled by it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it's a whole lot easier to clean out your refrigerator than it is to clean out your heart.
Yeah,
it is.
And you know, if the source of the unclean thoughts and actions is your heart/mind, that's a difficult thing to fix.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have all these thoughts going through your mind and you really don't have control over the actual thought. You can kind of talk the thought down, or, you know, apply your learning and understanding to it and think in the right direction. But the random thoughts that go through your head are kind of uncontrollable. Stuff just kind of pops in your head and you think, no. Mm-mm.
But it's what comes out of your mouth. It's what you do with those thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I drive down the road sometime, I see somebody do something stupid and I'm thinking, I'd like to pull them out of the car and beat them with a Louisville Slugger, but I don't.
That's right. Yep. Yep.
You should go with me up and down 95 every Friday and Saturday.
It's a good thing you're not still in uniform, huh?
I know. Well, that's the thing, you have thoughts and impulses, but you think, no, well, that doesn't really fit with who I want to be.
Mhm.
But still, talk about what comes out of your mouth. When somebody pulls in front of me, I'm not singing hosannas. I can tell you that right now. Now, if I'm in the car by myself and I say it out loud, does that make me a bad person? No worse than me thinking those words.
I say it out loud and then I apologize to God.
I start thinking I'm bad about the third time I've hit him with a baseball bat. It's,
But go back to, I guess it's verse 20. I wish Barclay put the verse numbers in his translations, but anyhow, for Acts, he lists pernicious thoughts. So what would be a pernicious thought? Let me see how my Bible translated pernicious thoughts. 15:20. Evil intentions. All right.
That's an extra point Scrabble word right there.
Yeah. Put that on a triple word score. It's got a P in it. Pernicious thoughts, so evil thoughts, acts of murder, adultery, theft, false witness, slander. It is these things which defile a man.
boy, I tell you, we've got some real problems with Capitol Hill then.
Well, it's across the universe. But go back. Barclay does, I think, makes a very good point. Go back to the Beatitudes, the beginning of Jesus' teachings in Matthew. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Putting it all in context. All right, so now we're kind of shifting gears with the next passage.
Well, wait a minute. I want to read one thing from
Do.
that about this. If religion consists in external regulations and observances, it is two things. It is far too easy. Not just easy, it's too easy. It is very much easier to abstain from certain foods and to wash hands in a certain way than it is to love the unlovely and the unlovable, and to help the needy at the cost of one's own time and money and comfort and pleasure. I liked that paragraph a lot.
I did too. And I have long been suspect of Christian teachings that focus on, well, if you just do this, everything will be perfect.
And one problem I had with the Baptists, at least the ones that I grew up with, you've got to believe. You've got to think that once you believe, once you accept Jesus, you're good. And I don't remember a whole lot of emphasis, other than you can't go, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. And the churches I grew up in were really not very strict in terms of you can't. But once you were saved, you were good. And I don't remember a lot of emphasis on living a good life, living a Christian life. I just don't remember that. It was always about salvation. And I'm sitting there thinking, I was saved years ago. Why are you still talking to me about this? It's like it was all, and once you got to that point, there was no more spiritual development. There was no more, it was just this, it was in a rut. Did Stuart and Joe, y'all grew up Baptist. Did you have kind of the same thought process?
Yeah, I think so. It seems like everyone was concerned about the salvation. One thing that, listening to what we're talking about, looking back, I think it's funny that we were once saved, always saved, and we made a whole lot about Catholics going to confession. and, getting their plate cleared. That just wasn't right. You sinned, you had to be responsible for it. But yet, I was saved, so I was good. So
I just remember the love of God, the understanding of God. We weren't taught that. It was the hell and damnation. If you do this, you're going to hell. That was just it. The love of God just simply wasn't taught. I didn't discover the love of God, I guess, until I was well into my 30s, late 30s. I was afraid because I had always been, if you did this, you were damned. Forget that,
or guilt. My grandmother had been a missionary, and at age 4 or 5, they took nails and she'd hold my hand and they drove nails right through his hand, and she'd take her finger and, punch in my palm and everything.
Right.
And it was tremendous amount of guilt.
When I had my first divorce, I mean, I really just thought, I'm damned to hell from now on. There's no hope for me whatsoever. It was the divorce, the religious aspects of my first divorce were the worst part about the divorce, because I was damned. That was it for me. So no, like I said, the love of God didn't come until much, much, much later. And I guess Southern Baptists, there seems to be so many Baptists nowadays, but Southern Baptists, as I said, you were taught the fear, or at least I was taught the fear of God, not the love of God. The love of God is a whole lot nicer.
And those tapes still can run in your head, every
Mhm.
And that's been part of the tough time I've been having here, is that the churches that I go to or I visit, if they are of the Baptist tradition, it is the fear of God, the fear of God. And this is coming even from preachers who are younger than me, way younger than me. It's just the message is, I keep thinking, why do I want to go to church and get beaten up every Sunday?
Well, and that's for a lot of folks, because when we were growing up, that was especially in the South, that was the culture. You went to church. If you didn't go to church on Sunday mornings, you were weird. And so you went to church, so you got that message. And now the younger ones, they're seeing that hypocrisy. They're more likely to see the hypocrisy, I think, and they're not as willing to put up. They're not as tolerant of that, and so see the hypocrisy of some of the teachings in the church.
Well, I actually met a woman within the last couple of years. She's the secretary of my financial advisor, and she was looking for a new church home and asked me about mine. And she said, well, do you get the good hellfire and damnation preaching? Because that's what I want. And I said, no, not in my church. She went, no, I like that. And I thought, lady, I kept my mouth shut amazingly, but I thought she was crazy.
I would have too. Young people question where we didn't question. You were told and that was it.
Right.
Well, that's where my father was unusual in that he taught me to question everything. So I didn't get, and the churches we went to, even though they were Southern Baptist, the preachers were not the hellfire and damnation. But it was a case of, you got to be saved, you got to be saved, you got to be saved over and over and over again.
That was the struggle that I had with Billy Graham. I know a lot of people, but it was like, that was the whole purpose. And I was like, but what next? What next? So Because that was all I heard out of his message was,
But I think he was he felt his purpose was to do volume. In other
Yeah.
words, get the conversion of as many people as possible. And then past that point, he's going to hand it off to somebody else.
right.
You
And
know?
he had an ethical structure, like he always worked off of a salary, so.
I read a very interesting article about him, oh, maybe 6, 7, 8 months ago, how he liked the spotlight.
Yeah.
He very much liked that, and he liked being seen with the top political people and so forth. And I had never really thought about it, but he really was very active in public life with famous people.
Yeah, somebody did a documentary on his life. I saw on television just within the last month or so. It was fascinating, and it made that very same point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Nobody's perfect.
Well, it goes back to his whole point that Claire was saying. If you want to get to impact the greatest number of people, the best way to do it is by influencing the leaders.
That and also remember now, he did crusades. So that was not the same thing as a daily or weekly minister pastor type scenario. I mean, the whole emphasis was totally different. And I don't know much about Graham from that kind of personal thing, but I would also I question everything too, and I would question the source on, there are a lot of people who love to sell books and magazine articles about, surmising about someone's intent. And I doubt if they know Graham's intent. But anyway, I just would say I'd question that a little bit too.
My favorite devotional is called Onto the Hills, and it's by Billy Graham. And I just keep rereading it. When I finish it, I just reread it over again. And it's just, I just like the way he, I don't know, I just like his style or whatever. But I have come from reading that, I have come to understand, at least I think, that his purpose was specifically just, as I said, volume. And then, because I guess they always talk about we all have a different purpose in God's plan. And I think that, if God knew not to make me the leader of a crusade. I have to talk to more than 3 people, I faint. So,
Well, and I don't want, my comments to be interpreted as I think there were a lot of very good qualities about Billy Graham. I do. And some of his writings I very much appreciated. And living in North Carolina, Billy Graham was revered. When he died, his funeral was broadcast on all the local TV stations. That's, his son Franklin is a different matter, is an entirely different matter. And if you want to see my mother get on a soapbox, just say Franklin Graham to her. And she'll give it to you. So, but anyhow, so to kind of wrap up for today, I think these 2 passages, the power, there's just so much in Matthew and so much in all the New Testament, but the power of what Jesus is confronting and what he is saying, and how he is redefining, refocusing, whatever, the message of God, and how we can all, the Jews get really targeted, I think, unfairly, that, all these things, but what Jesus is confronting here, we see in Christianity as well, and in other human institutions as well. So it's an ongoing process to constantly reassess and where are we, what are we doing? Is this really what God's message is about, what God's love is about? So So next week is more groundbreaking information with the story of the Canaanite woman. So lots of groundbreaking stuff there too. So, all right, everybody have a good week.